Hi, I'm Alex Vitale, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. Welcome to another episode of the Critical Criminologist. Today I'm joined by Jennifer Cobbina, who's associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, and we're going to talk a little bit today about her book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, from NYU Press, Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter and How They Changed America. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm grateful to be
You
on.
bet. You bet. Give us a little overview of the book, please.
Sure. So Hands Up, Don't Shoot, it investigates how and why Ferguson and Baltimore really became highly publicized sites for protests against racially biased policing, as well as these broader structural inequalities. And so my book specifically examines how Ferguson and Baltimore residents understand their experiences with the police, and then how these experiences shape their perceptions of law enforcement. So the book, it examines really what galvanized Black Lives Matters as a social movement and how policing tactics during the demonstrations, how did that influence subsequent mobilization decisions among activists? In addition, I would say that the book also sheds light on historical racial oppression and how that continues to play out in modern day race relations and police practices. So it really takes into account the historical reality of race inequality, and it connects it to Black individuals' contemporary perceptions of and experiences with law enforcement, which is really what led to having these deep-seated grievances with law enforcement, and ultimately it's what motivated unprecedented protests following Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's death.
Now, you're in a criminal justice program and you work on a number of criminal justice issues, but there's a lot of social movements material in this book, which is one of the things that really stood out to me. I actually teach social movements with some regularity in addition to criminology and everything else. So how did you come at this? Did you start thinking this was a policing question and then had to engage the social movements literature, or had you already conceptualized this as a social movements issue?
So definitely, prior to this, I was not familiar with the social movements literature. I was primarily interested in people's experiences and perceptions of the police. However, at the same time, I also realized I was interested in why people were protesting, right, against law enforcement. And so I, made sure to ask a number of questions as it relates to policing, just regular policing, but also policing during social movements. And so I had to become a bit more acquainted with the social movements literature and really combine both literature within the book.
Now, you were a grad student in St. Louis when this all began, and you got connected to the Ferguson Action Research Collaborative. Can you tell us a little bit about that connection and what the collaborative was?
Sure. I do want to just a small correction. I wasn't a grad student. I received my doctorate at the University of Missouri St. Louis in 2009. But so I wasn't a grad student. However, how all of this came about was, like most people, after the death of Michael Brown, watching on television and social media, really trying to understand what was happening and the residents' outrage with regards to Michael Brown's death. And so the opportunity to really contribute to this collaborative group came when a colleague of mine, Victor Rios, he sent an email to a listserv that I'm a part of. And he asked me and a number of critical scholars who engage in social justice research if anyone wants to go to Ferguson and conduct interviews with protesters. And so I jumped at the chance because I was already watching closely what was happening. I also was outraged. So this was an opportunity to really interview and document the experiences of protesters and residents within the city of Ferguson after the killing of Michael Brown. And so and one of the reasons I jumped at the chance is, as I already mentioned, I lived in St. Louis for 5 years while pursuing my doctorate at the University of Missouri St. Louis from 2004 to 2009. But I lived in St. Louis, only a couple of minutes away from Ferguson. And so I certainly cared about what was happening in this area that I had lived in and called home for 5 years. And so really that email that I received to providing an opportunity to conduct interviews with protesters was really something that I jumped at the chance to do. And so there were a number of us scholars who went and conducted interviews, and that really became the Ferguson Action Research Collaborative. And so it was really great because you have a number of social justice researchers really understanding that history is being made, and we really wanted to document and magnify the voices of those who were protesting against racially biased policing.
Now, the data in the book, though, was all collected by you.
Yes.
Were members of the collaborative useful in terms of like looking at manuscript drafts or helping with the framing of this? Was there a sharing of research ideas?
No, so it really started, this collaborative group really started with, let's all go to Ferguson and conduct interviews. However, I also had, because I had resided in St. Louis, I had a lot of connections, which gave me an entree to interview 100 protesters and residents. And so with the collaborative group, it was a little bit more narrow. And so I interviewed more folks. I added a lot more questions that I was particularly interested in. But so that's how I got started, because of an email that came from Victor Rios about conducting interviews. And I expanded upon this study.
Well, kudos to Victor once again. Yeah. So, one of the things you find and you use to kind of frame your findings is this idea that that too often Black men in particular are guilty until proven innocent, that the criminal justice system has already prejudged us. So can you give us a flavor for how your interviews, reflected this idea?
Yeah, so respondents or participants in the study, they experienced this in several ways. One of those ways was through aggressive policing. There were some who reported that police acted aggressively towards Black civilians, especially Black males, particularly who lived in high crime neighborhoods. There were others who reported accusations or threats of physical abuse from the police, even though they were engaged in lawful activity. They were not engaging in any criminal activity. And so it was hard. It was not too hard for many residents to believe that both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's death was really the result of aggressive policing tactics. And I also want to mention that there were also some residents who believed that even Black officers were responded aggressively as well. But in addition to aggressive policing, Black males can experience also racial profiling. There were a number of participants who expressed frustration when they were stopped, particularly when they believed that there was no basis for doing so. So they emphasized the arbitrary nature of officers' decisions to stop and question young Black males. And typically this happened on a consistent basis. So it was not uncommon for Ferguson and Baltimore residents to believe that the police, they targeted their communities because officers assumed that young Black men who resided in these neighborhoods were viewed as threatening and suspicious, and ultimately criminals. And so, they were aware that police stops were tied to extra legal reasons or investigatory policing, right? So we know that legal reasons for being stopped have to do with such things as erratic driving, speeding, having faulty headlights or taillights. But yet at the same time, extra legal factors or investigatory policing is often shaped by factors such as race and gender, clothing, hairstyle, tattoos, all of these reasons. So the majority of participants believe that when they were stopped for reasons having to do with racial profiling. And then they also experienced, being guilty until proven innocent, even when they were being stopped, the disrespectful nature or the disrespectful way in which police treated them. So this was true of Black residents, but also poor white residents as well, who complained of verbal mistreatment or officers hurling racial slurs at them and making derogatory remarks.
And this comes to shape their view of the nature of policing as an institution.
Absolutely. In large parts, the majority of Black residents typically view police or officers as discriminatory enforcers who viewed Black individuals as suspicious, threatening, and criminal, particularly if they lived in disadvantaged communities. I want to say, though, a number acknowledge that, that law enforcement they talked about law enforcement is needed. They talked about the hard job that they had, but in general, they also perceived officers as biased and as these occupying forces who over-police the neighborhoods in an attempt to really restrict the movements of Black individuals. And they often thought that because they lived in neighborhoods that were characterized by, having lower socioeconomic status and having high levels of crime, that officers ultimately perceived them as being suspicious and dangerous. And that in turn, it prompted officers to behave more aggressively towards residents in these neighborhoods. And as we know, this further increases cynicism and distrust towards the police.
You mentioned, this is a broader problem of over-policing, which is something I want to talk about in a couple of different ways. But one of the things that I hear and I see that other people are hearing in highly policed communities is this kind of under-policing, over-policing dynamic, where the people feel like they have very real threats to their safety that the police don't seem to be able to address, but they also feel like police are out harassing people all the time. So there's this disconnect. How do you think about this under-policing, over-policing claim?
Yeah, I definitely see it as, definitely over-policing, and by under-policing, I see it as under protection, right? So both over-policing and under-policing or under-protection is taking place in these Black communities, right? Countless studies, including my own and others, have shown that over-policing that takes place in these disadvantaged Black neighborhoods include, for example, disproportionate experiences with surveillance and stops, disrespectful treatment and verbal abuse, arrest, the use of force, including excessive and deadly force. But at the same time, these communities, they also face fewer police protection or slower response times when they do call law enforcement. And so there are many, I think, Black communities that have to grapple with over-policing and under-protection in these neighborhoods.
So, one of my concerns about this framing of the problem is that it assumes that if the police just did their job properly and actually wanted to fight crime in these communities, that they could both successfully do that and they could successfully do that without disrespect and abuse. And I'm just not sure this is true, that even well-intentioned policing is not really going to be effective because it's just going after some of the symptoms, and that the techniques that are needed even to fight homicides and other things still require this aggressive war on crime kind of stance by the police. Did you find anything like that?
So, I definitely agree that what we found is that residents definitely talked about this war on crime mentality, the militarization of the police, and again, the aggressive nature of policing. Yet at the same time, I will say that there were residents who were victims of crimes and who did talk about how when they called the police, and when they did show up, when they showed up, particularly when it came to like property crimes, they appreciated that the officers showed up and appeared to be sincere and trying to find the alleged suspect. Yet at
But
the
of
same
course they almost never do, right? And this
yeah.
is true in white communities as well. I mean, the vast majority of burglaries, A, are not reported. The majority of those that are reported are never even investigated, and a very small percentage are actually solved.
Yes, I would agree. I would agree. And so there was certainly discussion amongst residents about slow response time, yet at the same time, and having to make sure that, you know, if you really want the police to show up, that you really have to kind of hype things up about the severity of the incident in order to get them to show up. Of those who did show up, residents did say which was largely for property crimes, if they showed up on time, they appreciated the fact that officers did show up and appeared to be concerned.
Yeah. So back to this tension between the experience of policing and how it shapes police views. Is there a gendered element to this? Do women experience this slightly differently?
So I also found that in a smaller percent of cases, residents, they also reported that Black women, they were also targets of racial profiling and in some cases aggressive policing. So there were a few who believed that police treatment, it was tied again to the neighborhoods, right? The neighborhoods in which they resided. And even though fewer residents reported this, there are again studies that show an identical pattern of racial disparities in police stops for women. So 1 year prior to Michael Brown's death, Black women residing in Ferguson, they were stopped by police for traffic violations much more frequently than any other category of motorists. And there were certainly a number of women in my study who talked about being racially profiled and aggressively policed, and even during the social movements, talking about being the recipients of excessive use of force as well. And so Black women, not as much, but certainly Black women had comparable experiences of being targeted, harassed, as well as being verbally assaulted, just as Black men.
Yeah. So, you know, the title of your book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, you know, a reference to the claims that, you know, Michael Brown had his hands up when he was shot. That has, you know, been called into question by one of the coroner's reports and some counter narratives. Ultimately, do you think it matters to the people that you interviewed whether or not he had his hands up or the exact details of how Michael Brown was killed?
So I definitely, you know, I think, so in general, I think in terms of whether or not Michael Brown had his hands up, initially that drove many people to go to protest, right? So the belief that he had his hands up and he was shot. But then there were also larger issues in terms of police brutality, and that being just racially biased policing. Many arguing that they too had been the recipients of aggressive policing, or if not them personally, they experienced it indirectly or vicariously through other people, through their family members, their friends, or seeing always generally driving down and seeing, you know, Black civilians being arrested, being treated aggressively. And so I would say that regardless of whether Michael Brown had his hands up when he was killed, the larger issue is certainly over policing. It's, again, I found this in my study, but it's also been captured in other studies as well. In fact, so following Michael Brown's killing, the Department of Justice, they published a searing report that showed, it documented racially biased policing taking place within the Ferguson Police Department. So based upon data collected from the Ferguson Police Department from 2012 to 2014, what they found is that African Americans accounted for about 85 to 93% of stops, citations, and arrests, even though they comprise of 67% of the population within the city. They also found that African Americans are more than twice as likely as white drivers to be searched during vehicle stops, but yet 25 26% less likely to actually be found in possession of a contraband. Similar findings were found in Baltimore. Again, the Department of Justice, they did their own investigation and they published a report documenting racial bias within the police department in Baltimore. They found that, African Americans consisted of about 82% of people who were stopped for traffic violations, even though they comprise of 60% of the city's population within driving age. And again, they were more likely to be searched, but yet less likely to be found in possession of a contraband. And so I would certainly argue that the broader issue is over policing Black civilians. Many criminologists have found that in their studies. I found it in my studies. And we also see that the Department of Justice did their own investigation and came to the same conclusion.
Yeah, the data is very similar for stop and frisk in New York, where the stops were incredibly racially disparate, but the hit rate, the rate at which police actually found contraband, was much higher in the white stops.
Yeah.
Indicating, that they used a lot more careful discretion in whether or not they were going to stop a white person. They really had to have a reason to think that this was the case, while the stops of Black and brown folks were much more indiscriminate in terms of the basis for the stop. Yeah. So
absolutely. Yeah, the bar tends to be a little bit higher when making the decision to stop white individuals.
And as you point out, the race of the officer is not protective here of Black and brown folks. It does not affect the outcome of these stops or the choice about who to stop. The racial profiling, in other words, does not appear to be motivated by individualized racial animus by specific officers. Is that right?
Yeah. So, I know that there's a call to diversify the police force, and I understand that, and it certainly has intuitive appeal. However, what I argue in my book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, is that it's a simple solution to a much more complex problem. What I found is that 25% of those interviews that I did, they argue that African Americans officers, they operated much more aggressively when they do encounter Black civilians. And these sentiments, they were much more common among Baltimoreans, Black residents who lived in Baltimore, who in Baltimore at the time of Freddie Gray's death, nearly half of the police force was Black, right? And when you had a Black police chief, you have a Black mayor, you have, a Black, the prosecutor is Black. So you just have a number of Blacks in these leadership positions. In contrast, in Ferguson, that was not the case. 95% of officers within the police department in Ferguson was white at the time of Michael Brown's death. And yet what we see is that particularly among Baltimore residents, again, not everyone, the 25% sample argued that and experienced aggressive policing tactics by Black officers. And so the question is, with hiring more Black officers, would it improve the police department? It's possible, but again, I think it's a very simple solution to a complicated problem. So simply hiring a higher proportion of Black officers in the police force, it does not indicate that the department will function better. If Black officers are hired, particularly, and if they are placed in occupational settings that socialize them also to embrace stereotypes of Black civilians being viewed as more threatening and suspicious and ultimately more criminal, then it would be also illogical to expect improvements in police civilian relationships. And then I think the other thing I also want to say is we know that in general, Blacks, they disproportionately reside in socially disorganized neighborhoods, right? That's burdened with high rates of unemployment, poverty, have high levels of decay. And so Ferguson, St. Louis metropolitan area, the city of Baltimore, they all have long histories of racial isolation and disadvantage. And research shows that high rates of poverty and disorder and crime, it then ultimately affects the type and quality of policing that civilians in these neighborhoods receive. And so consequently, distrust and animosity characterizes these relationships. And so I would argue that it's then unrealistic to assume that higher proportions of Black officers within a police force will improve citizens' views towards the police if we don't address these structural problems within poor neighborhoods.
And by the same token, giving them implicit bias training or some of these other, diversity training programs is not going to help either.
Yeah, so in the conclusion section of the book, I make that case that too often there is a tendency to call for police reform that entails increased training in diversity, implicit bias, and de-escalation. There's a tendency to call for police reform that entails more police technology and surveillance and manpower. And while there's certainly, there is a need for new training regimes, there is a need to eliminate militarized tactics on civilians, and there's a need for much more greater oversight of the police and accountability. But again, I believe we're mistaken if we think that these are adequate solutions to reducing abusive policing and the racial subordination of Black individuals. I don't think the focus can be solely on investing more dollars into law enforcement. We've been doing that for decades, right? And we continue to see Black and brown individuals being the recipients of excessive police force and dying at the hands of the police. And so what I think needs to happen is having increased investments in marginalized individuals and communities. And structural disadvantage, pervasive inequality, joblessness, inadequate public services, these are all common characteristics in inner city neighborhoods. And so not surprisingly, crime is also taking place in these neighborhoods. And so I believe if funds should be used on prevention and intervention initiatives for at-risk youth and young adults. I believe that dollars need to be spent on addressing issues of mental health, substance abuse, and homelessness. And resources should also be used to bring more jobs into communities, jobs that offer a living wage and that provide quality education. And so I wholeheartedly believe that if we're going to end the killing of Black people, it requires also doubling down on investments in communities, not necessarily the police or the criminal justice system.
And this is ultimately a political problem, right? I think too often the analysis of both criminal justice researchers and, frankly, community members, political activists, ends at the police department, so that their ire is focused at the chief of police or a police commission, and then the elected officials who have created this disinvestment and then turn the problem over to the police kind of get a pass.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. This is definitely a political problem, a political issue, and so which makes it even more challenging to address, these issues, because it doesn't just stop at with the police chief or and certainly not at just rank and file officers, and so. Because if we're going to argue about these broader structural problems that need to be addressed, we know these issues, it's not going to take place, it's not going to be solved within a year or two. It requires a long-term investment, but I certainly would argue that needs to be done if we actually want to see real solutions take place. Because if that's not done, I believe many of the solutions that we come up with, it's going to be mediocre at best.
So we've seen in the last week or two a series of really troubling videos of police enforcing social distancing measures here in New York, but even in other cities. And, a lot of this has been targeted at African Americans. So what do you think the role of police should be during the lockdown? And do you have some sense of what we should be doing differently?
Yeah, I think the role of the police during, this pandemic that we're living in is to protect and serve the public in a fair and an equitable manner. I think that aggressive enforcement of social distancing laws, as we've seen in New York and other places, is certainly problematic. When it comes to this pandemic, the goal should not be to criminalize or arrest those who are violating social distance laws, because we can't arrest our way in this pandemic. That's not going to work. But I think the role really needs to be about educating the public. So if someone is violating social distance laws, they should be encouraged to distance themselves and be given a mask if they're not wearing one, which we see happening, law enforcement doing that in most cases when dealing with white individuals. We don't see that taking place when dealing with Black individuals, and so this is not new. I think COVID-19 is certainly magnifying, the inequalities, the racial inequalities that we know already exist.
Do you think that there is some of the non-compliance is driven by, pre-existing deep skepticism in the African American community about having certain kinds of elected leaders up on a stage, wagging a finger at them, telling them what they need to do that's in their best interest?
Yeah, there's certainly distrust, right? In terms of, with a number of, Black and brown individuals not trusting the administration, not trusting what comes out of his mouth, because it's just like there's already been evidence that there is that the lives of Black individuals is not a priority, with the present administration. And so, and certainly we know too that when it first came out about the importance of wearing masks, and even if you don't have a mask, wearing a bandana just to cover yourself, certainly a lot of Black and brown individuals expressing concern and fear that if I do that, I'm well aware of the stereotype that comes with that. I look like a quote unquote criminal, as someone who's involved in gang activity. And so, there's this real tension about trying to avoid COVID-19, but at the same time, in wearing a non-surgical mask like a bandana, risking then having contact with law enforcement because of stereotypes, assuming that now one looks even more suspicious. And so there is certainly this real tension, and I would argue that during this time, rather than aggressively policing or even policing to try to, the real issue needs to be about public safety. And the same way that white individuals or middle-class individuals would be treated, and if they violate social distancing laws, should be the same way that Black and brown individuals are also treated.
Well, and I think that we need to do more to improve the way the public health messaging is communicated, because the credibility problem isn't only with the president, right? There's a credibility problem with state and local leaders in some cases, and even with the health establishment in some cases, right? The African American community has been subjected to abuses from the health community, improper testing like the Tuskegee experiment, et cetera. And so I keep wondering, where are the community voices being lifted up by the administration and the media? Community tailored and delivered by people who have credibility in a wide variety of communities.
Absolutely, and I think that's needed, given the distrust that minority communities have, with, like you said, with the healthcare system, with law enforcement, with politics. It's certainly what we need is certainly much more stakeholders within the community. Speaking on behalf of members within the community to elevate their concerns, as well as solutions on how to move forward. But, because what we know also is that law enforcement is often called as well to really solve, health problems, from mental health problems, issues of homelessness. We rely on law enforcement to solve so many of our world's problems, and we know that law enforcement, they can't do that, and they don't do it effectively, right? And so and I think that's where that real tension lies. And so when I think of the police officers' role during this time, it should be really just encouraging social distancing and educating the public in terms of why social distancing is important, even if one does not feel like they will catch the virus, or if they have the virus, they feel like they will be they'll make it through. Again, understanding how one can unwittingly really unwillingly cause other people to catch the virus and ultimately potentially result in their untimely death.
Yeah, when we turn a problem over to the police to solve, there's some level of policy failure at the root of that.
Yes, I concur. I wholeheartedly, believe that the role of law enforcement should be to try to protect and serve the public, but we should not be having them also really take on the role of mental health and public health issues, because that's a problem. And so even when we look at the number of people who are being cited or receiving summons for violating social distancing laws, we see who comprises of that. It's largely Black individuals, even though I personally have seen a number of individuals, white and Black, violating social distancing laws, and many others have seen that too. But it gets back at the discretion in terms of who we deem as being suspicious and threatening. And so, but again, at the root cause of that is, like you said, these is policy laws.
And certain populations are viewed as always already guilty of something.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So tell us what you're working on now.
So yeah, I'm working currently on a project that examines the impact of neighborhood context on the decision-making process of adolescents, youth, to either engage in or avoid violent activity. So what we're doing is we're going to be collecting interview data in 2 neighborhoods within the city of Detroit. One which is that has high concentration of disadvantage and violence, and one which has a low level of concentrated disadvantage and violence, to really understand how the decision-making process of adolescents' decisions to engage in violent activity or avoid violent activity. But in addition, we're also proposing a study that focuses on the decision-making process among law enforcement and youth during this, COVID-19. We're interested in examining specifically how COVID-19 is affecting how police enforce the law, but also looking at how youth make decisions during this time, and also trying to get a better understanding as to how COVID-19 is reshaping the way that neighborhoods are operating.
You mentioned you're doing this research in Detroit. Detroit has been one of the cities targeted by the Justice Department for Operation Relentless Pursuit. Have you seen this new development? The bar folks have chosen 7 cities to flood with federal police and money to create task forces.
I'm sorry, it broke up. Can you say that again?
Oh, sorry. So the Attorney General Barr has created this Operation Relentless Pursuit that is targeting 7 cities that have violent crime problems, and they're going to flood those cities with federal law enforcement and money for local police to create these task forces to go after the worst of the worst. And Detroit is one of the cities that's being targeted.
Yeah, so I had heard of that as well. And so and this is what led me and my team to also kind of shape our our decision to look what we already knew we wanted to look within the city of Detroit. But we're interested in seeing, we changed our research questions to also include the issue of COVID-19 and specifically looking at how violence is being how people are making decisions to engage in violent activity. But we also saw that it was necessary to include law enforcement, because if they are also aggressively policing residents within the city, that's also a form of violence which we also want to capture as well.
And I did a call with a whole coalition of folks in Detroit last week that are trying to organize local opposition to this initiative. So I think that's something that's going to become more of a public issue in Detroit in the coming months.
Yeah, and we already know that, Detroit is so hard hit with dealing with COVID-19 as well. Really, the city is in survival mode right now, as COVID-19 has really again magnified the number of inequities that are existing within poor communities of color, where we know that African Americans are being disproportionately affected by the virus.
Yeah. So do you have some books you've read recently that you want to recommend to others?
Yeah, so there is definitely The Limits of Community Policing. I know you've already had Louis Daniel Gasson and Aaron Russell on your podcast, on the radio show. So there's that book, but there's also a book by Andrea Boyles, You Can't Stop the Revolution. It's about community disorder and social ties in the post-Ferguson America. There's also a book called Stay Woke. It's a People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matters by Tehama Buniasi and Candace Smith. I would recommend that. And then finally, I would also recommend the book Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudices That Shape What We See, Think, and Do by Jennifer Eberhardt.
Yes. I've been wanting to take a close look at that one, because I've been very critical of the implicit bias training, orientation, and thinking that, we can solve the racism problem in America by getting people to pay attention to their unconscious bias without also addressing, deep structural mechanisms that reproduce racial inequality in the United States.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think always the key is getting to these broader structural problems and inequalities, which too often are left out of the conversation when we talk about these broader problems of law enforcement, and even problems with regards to the criminal legal system as well.
Well, Jennifer, thanks so much for taking some time to talk with me today and sharing this really interesting research. The book is Hands Up, Don't Shoot, about Baltimore and Ferguson, from NYU Press. And I hope we get a chance to talk in person at some future date at ASC or another similar gathering.
Yeah, I look forward to that as well.